I'm Caleb Kidcoy, Epic Legacy Hero Builder, and I'd like to welcome you to Living Like a Bank. Along with myself, you'll hear from other successful experts and people who are busy serving and empowering many lives. You'll see how we're showing others to become debt-free in record time as they build economic discipline while generating a bulletproof family legacy revenue stream together. We'll learn how to live and operate just like the banks do. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Caleb Kidcoy here, your alchemized slayer of mediocrity, heroic family legacy builder, and host of the Living Like a Bank podcast. And we're back talking about the business book club today. You know, I wanted to mention that getting on campus and teaching these young, hungry minds is one of the highlights of my week, of my month. And this week it was the topic of international banking, particularly money is debt. 2006, I read this little book right here called The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin, a second look at the Federal Reserve, and it was life-changing. You talk about going down the rabbit hole and an eye-opening, transformative journey to understanding the foundations of money and economics. And guys, much of the reason we do these podcasts is to help educate you, inform you, and help you understand the foundations of money and finance, insurance, banking, everything like that, so that you can take those tools and empower yourself and your family legacy moving forward. So pay attention, because today, oh boy, we're going to have some more fun discussing the 48 laws of power with Mr. Robert Greene. And joining me back in the studio, Coach Chris. What's up, Chris?
I'm feeling into this topic today. We're back to the laws of power. We're going to talk about some things like no mercy from the edge of the blade and stuff like that. When should we be merciful? Should we ever be merciful?
Should we be merciful? Law number 15, Chris. Look at that. Crush your enemy totally. Are we supposed to have enemies to begin with? Look at this judgment. All great leaders since Moses have known that a feared enemy must be crushed completely. Sometimes they learn this the hard way. If one ember is left alight, no matter how dimly it smolders, a fire will eventually break out. More is lost through stopping halfway than through total annihilation. The enemy will recover and will seek revenge. Crush him, not only in body, but in spirit. Brutal, Chris. Where are we going with this, man?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, I understand it's a fantasy, okay? But if you have something that's true evil, everything you just said 100% applies, right? Maybe even your creature from Jekyll Island, okay? Maybe even 401k plans. Okay, we can talk a little bit more about all that stuff. But let's stick to Dracula for now. If you have a Dracula loose in London, Dracula isn't going to stop for anything. Dracula is just going to keep making more vampires. Nothing's going to stop
consumption.
The only thing that's going to stop it is a group of like-minded people working together, the so-called crew of light, right? In the story. And I know it's just a story, but all stories have meaning behind them, of course. And so there's all kinds of things like in the world today, turn on any news channel, right? And, I don't think that anybody anywhere other than maybe Hamas themselves would call Hamas anything other than pure evil after what they did in Israel, and what they're continuing to do. And not to mention other terrorist groups. And we've seen ISIS, and clearly ISIS has disgustingly influenced the tactics that Hamas and Hezbollah are now willing to use. So there is evil. And when there is evil and we need to confront that evil, this law applies. When are we going to use power if not to confront evil?
Do you feel like we need to define, Chris, what makes something or someone inherently evil? Is this something that's open to personal interpretation, or is this somewhat of a global, if you will, moral compass that we're talking about? I'm just curious to see what your thoughts are, because I know we don't all view everything in the same light or perspective. But to you, what makes something or someone inherently evil? Devaluing human life, taking human life? I mean, that would be maybe a starting point.
That's clearly a good starting point. And taking it in a literal way, such as murder, or abusing it in some horrible way, such as rape or crime or fraud. Those are all
human trafficking.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And then we could get into things that are a little bit less obvious. But I already mentioned fraud. There's outright fraud, but then there's also legal fraud. Okay. And notice that on my, I'm not bald technically right here. I just keep it really short, right? But on my shiny little dome here that does not have a tinfoil hat, okay, I am going to talk about how the government in my lifetime, when I was about 5 years old in 1974, I just dated myself. Oh well, but they created a series of systems, and I'm not going to bore everybody right now. We do educational webinars to get more into it. But it's basically the 401k and IRA system. And that system basically created a situation unlike previous generations of Americans, where the employer, the business owner, provided for the retirement of eligible employees who worked there long enough. Okay. And when this 401k qualified money system came in, it was basically, I'm going to call it a scam, a legal scam that the government perpetrated because they knew demographically that there was going to be a big decline in population. And they knew that if they got people to defer their taxes, Caleb, is defer mean not pay?
No, it means just push it down the road a bit.
Right. And in the meantime, it's going to be growing, so you're going to owe more in the future, right?
Good point.
And you're going to pay, and if you put it into an IRA or a qualified plan or something, you're going to pay taxes on all of it, right? So to me, that might not be quite as glaringly obvious as rape or murder or outright theft, but it's pretty close to theft when you start looking specifically at 401k plans and even most IRAs, brokerage plans anywhere really, but let's focus on the qualified stuff. They're charging upwards of 3% fees. About the lowest of the low are around 2% fees, and they're not really managing anything. There's a book I got recently, Caleb. I'm going to do a show and tell here for a second. It's written by a stockbroker. It's called the 5 Mistakes That Investors Make. Okay, and I'm not even going to run through them right now. All I'm going to say is that they're all avoidable by things that millions of people have already learned about through basic indexed annuities and indexed universal life products that are available through literally thousands of companies. This isn't a commercial for any one of those companies, but the idea of putting money at risk in the stock market and then having a quote stockbroker charge you 3% to give you questionable advice about risk and taxes, that reminds me a lot of Dracula. We got a producer pop in. What's up, Michael?
Well, I'm going to kind of tie some threads there together. So you'd started with the question of what is evil. Then you kind of got into the whole 401ks and IRAs and qualified plans and stuff like that. For me, in terms of an answer to your question, would be for myself, and we're fairly philosophical, but I mean, evil is if you're in the position of taking other people's choices away, you are the evil one. Anytime someone's taking your choices away, that is evil. So in terms of, right or wrong, whatever feelings people might have about those type of plans of whether they are a good or a bad choice or investment, when you're put in a position where, because the government has made it a tax advantage for the business to put the money into those type of plans, and then the business doesn't give the employee a choice about what to do with that money, because the majority of large employers are not giving the employee a choice. They're not saying, hey, here's 5 options of, I'm going to put aside this money or, take your money and do something with it, and I'm going to give you 5 choices. They're like, nah, the government has made this one the only tax advantaged one, so your money's going into a 401k. You don't have a choice.
Yep. I think that's a good distinction, Michael. Taking away choice, right? And so I think going back to Caleb's original question about, is there a universal answer to what's evil? I would really balk at that. I mean, if so, who's going to presume to tell me what that is? And I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm not going to offer one. Okay. I might say one that you might agree with, or Michael might agree with, or you might not, but I can only really speak for myself, as you asked me to, right? And I don't want to be too overly influenced by what Michael just said, but the theme of what we've been talking about with the other part of our podcast we're doing right now with Napoleon Hill is thinking for oneself and not being unduly influenced by outside sources, right?
Mm-hmm.
Having said that, we don't want to be in isolation either, because could any one person have fought against Dracula? Could Von Helsing himself fought? No. The answer is no. If you haven't read the book for a while or seen the movie, the answer is no. If you don't remember, Dracula was as strong as like 20 men and could like turn into a wolf or a bat or, all kinds of stuff like that. They needed to work together. So as individuals who were in charge of their own mind, they were working together. I've got one more Dracula analogy I want to get to before I forget it. In the book, remember, Lucy, of course, everybody remembers, turns into a vampire. Now, we have to remember for a second that Lucy, before she got the vampire thing, was like quite beautiful, right? And in every way, right? Intelligent, lively, smart, witty, everything that young men would be attracted to, from a good family, all of it, right? And she had, not surprisingly, shocker, a number of suitors. Here's what I'm trying to get to. If those suitors thought of each other as enemies and defined each other as enemies and used that as a pretext to crush each other, all of London might have turned into vampires. See what I'm getting to?
Mm-hmm.
So accurately understanding who's just a rival, but who actually should be working with you against the larger problem in the Crew of Light to work against this Dracula figure. Ultimately, that's what it is. And I keep going back to that story because I just read it again recently after, it's been decades since I read it as a kid, So it was fun to read it again. It's a great read, by the way. There's a free version of it on Audible, by the way. This isn't a commercial for Audible, but since it's free, I got to mention it. If you have an Audible account, it's quite good. There's some famous actors in it.
The whole idea of this entity, Chris, of Dracula, or the way that it was created, this aura about it. I mean, it's really intriguing. And I remember growing up as a kid playing Castlevania on Nintendo, and there was an aura that I could feel as I went through that game. I can't describe it, but just that association behind this pure evil, if you will, or an entity that is encompassed around that. And people's minds could go to Hitler. I don't know, but the driving force behind that, right, was what? Number one, human nature. The guy had to drink blood, allegedly, to survive, right? To become immortal, to get stronger. But there was obviously an obsessive control for power, greed, whatever it is that we find, referenced here in Robert Greene's book. And this first story, we were talking about this at the beginning, in China was very intriguing. Song Yu and Liu Pang. I mean, what a dynasty, right? And this isn't the first time we've seen Greene reference a story like this. What was your initial interpretation? Because Chris, he talks about the ruthlessness that you had on many occasions, and that's what's being referenced here. So, can we be kind, moral individuals and be ruthless toward our enemy or what we perceive as an enemy, like evil?
Well, we have to be. Once we've defined something as evil or we're at war with it, then there can be no exception. There can be no question. So my only caution, which we already went over, is whether we're calling the right people enemies and whether we're working together with the right people. So that's the one word of caution. I did take the opportunity to spend an hour and a half listening to The Art of War again this morning as preparation for this podcast. And it's very, very clear and obvious that without trying to do a summary of The Art of War, but once you've defined someone truly as an enemy and you are at war, and most of The Art of War is about cautioning people against acting too hastily and being too aggressive and fighting too much, if you've never read The Art of War. And another really big principle of The Art of War is there's never a good long war. You gotta win it. You gotta knock him out, kill him, and get out. We've talked before on this podcast about Miyamoto Musashi and the Book of Five Rings, or Gorin Desu in Japanese. And you strike only to kill. You can parry, you can thrust, you can jab, you can move for defense, but you strike only to kill. And so,
as Dracula did go for the throat.
Well, with Dracula, getting back to that, so I actually looked up a couple essays that have been written about, and according to the AI generated search on Google, Dracula is a symbol of the old vices of the past and the influence of history and orthodoxy. And the Crew of Light represents what Napoleon Hill might call accurate thinking, and they might represent what Napoleon Hill, not Bonaparte, we're talking about both of them right now in these few minutes, but Napoleon Hill would call that a mastermind. And Dracula, it's the Crew of Light. Because without that mastermind, they never could have defeated Dracula. They just couldn't have. And getting back to Robert Greene, if you've identified something as truly evil, you have to rip it all out, right? Like getting back to the Middle East, and I don't see how we can't do that right now. We were talking with Michael. Michael, is it okay if I quote you, unless you want to just speak for yourself?
No, go ahead.
Okay, I liked what you said. So with your permission, Michael was basically pointing out that from his point of view, which I happen to agree with, and it's just our points of view, right? Everybody's entitled to their own viewpoint. But when it comes to the Palestinians, they are sworn to not agree with the existence of Israel. Whereas Israel doesn't feel the same way about them. It's not an officially stated political motive of their entity. And so when someone's purpose in life is to destroy you, I would have a hard time not defining that as an enemy.
Good moment of silence there.
Yeah.
And you want to continue that thought?
I think that we should probably, if there's any other slides that we want to get to, I think we pretty much nailed that. I mean, you got to make a decision about who your enemy is. Once you've defined that enemy, if you've really defined it as an enemy, yeah, you have to crush it.
And I'll just piggyback on that by saying, right, it ultimately isn't about taking sides here, is it? It's about defining and determining, right? What are we looking at here as evil? What is the motive? And what are people going to do ultimately to survive, to defend themselves? Machiavelli quote right here in the Keys to Power: authority, it must be noted that men must either be caressed or else annihilated. I mean, the two extremes there. They will revenge themselves for small injuries, but cannot do so for great ones. The injury, therefore, that we do to a man must be such that we need not fear his vengeance. And that kind of goes back to what you said, wipe them out, go for the throat type of, mentality, if you will.
Listen, bro, you might not agree with it, but it worked for the Empress Wu Zetian, right? I mean, there was that whole story about all the things that she did. And I'm just going to take a liberty here for just a second. And because sometimes the only thing that works is no mercy from the edge of the blade. I mean, there's a taste of fear, right? When the henchmen come. And Wu Zetian did all of that. We don't even need to go through all the things that she did, but she was just utterly ruthless in getting her way to the top. And she was one of, if not, I don't think she was the longest, but one of the longest serving regents in the vast history of China.
And a concubine originally who became an empress. They highlighted her wisdom, intelligence, her energy. Obviously, she recognized in order to maintain this position that I'm in, because she was aware it could be easily taken out for under her. She could be the next person, removed, decapitated, whatever they did back then. She had to navigate her way around that and attain an extraordinary position of power. A lot of wisdom there.
Yep. And clearly with Bonaparte, we just saw that Bonaparte quote there from Michael. If you look at the history of the great conquerors, whether it's Caesar, Alexander, Bonaparte, heck, I'm going to even throw in Abraham Lincoln / Ulysses S. Grant. Okay. And we could add plenty of other people to that list, but they all had this mindset. There's no exception to this rule when you're in a situation of war.
Yep. I like this little image here. A viper crushed beneath your foot but left alive will rear up and bite you with a double dose of venom. An enemy that is left around is like a half-dead viper that you nurse back to health. Time makes the venom grow stronger. And again, we read numerous examples throughout history of this being the case. So as we kind of move into the reversal here, Chris, did you have final thoughts? You know, we talked a little about Israel and Palestine. I thought it was interesting that Greene used the example of Moses back in history, right? Essentially when they were pursued by Pharaoh, and, you know, Pharaoh's army was wiped out. Did you want to touch on that at all?
Just recapping the biblical story, you know, and even if you're not Jewish or Christian, it is pretty much the basis for the claim of the state of Israel. And according to the Bible story, for those who don't know, I assume most people know, but if you don't know, everybody knows about Moses parting the Red Sea. Everybody pretty much knows about the 10 Commandments. The book reminds us of how when Moses got the 10 Commandments and he came down and found his people worshiping the golden calf, all the ones that were actually worshiping the golden calf were knocked off. And so only the people who hadn't been worshiping the golden calf went on to the promised land. And because Moses had been a little bit impatient one time and a little bit unfaithful and had hit a rock with his stick, smote the rock, so to speak, he wasn't allowed to go into the land himself. And Jacob led the people in. And of course, when they got there, they completely adopted this doctrine. The walls of Jericho, you know.
The walls of Jericho. And there was this great leader named Joshua, a guy named Caleb, I think, defeated all these giants. And anyway, pretty interesting historical story.
All those dudes.
So talking about the reversal, this is interesting right here, Michael, if you want to bring that up. This law should be rarely ignored. It does sometimes happen. It's better to let your enemies destroy themselves. And here it says, sometimes by crushing an enemy, you embitter them so much they spend years and years plotting revenge. The Treaty of Versailles had such an effect on the Germans. Some would argue that in the long run, it would be better to show leniency. The problem is your leniency involves another risk. It may embolden the enemy who still harbors a grudge, but now has some room to operate. It's almost always wiser to crush your enemy. If they plot revenge years later, do not let your guard down, but simply crush them again. We didn't really, well, I guess he gave the one example. Versailles and the Germans was kind of the primary example of where they didn't finish off what they started, if you will, Chris. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, they definitely messed up Versailles, but then they kind of got it right with the Marshall Plan after World War II and what we did with Japan. But I think that both of those still really illustrate this principle. If you look at the Marshall Plan after World War II, even though some people who were Nazis were still alive and in the system, they were stripped of all vestiges of Nazism, right? And those who were clearly a victim of war crimes and stuff were put in the Nuremberg trial and so on and so forth. And then in Japan, all the imperial power was removed, all the old families, all the old organization was removed. They were forced to take up. So, I mean, the old system of Japan was completely obliterated. It was crushed. The old system of Germany was crushed. It was completely obliterated. So that's what they got right. Instead of just leaving the old system in place and giving them punitive taxes, which is what they did in the Weimar Republic.
Yep. Good thoughts there, Chris. Well, guys, as always, there's a lot of suffering happening in our world. And sometimes we're going through our personal struggles, our own trials and tribulations. Let's remind ourselves that there's likely somebody else out there who's got it much, much worse. And I just can't imagine the horrors that are happening over there, the horrors of war. Yes, they've gone on throughout history. They're no less evil, if you will, today than they were thousands of years ago. It's brutal to see lives lost, bloodshed on any capacity, especially when it comes to innocent people and children and women and things like that. So if you're a praying person, please uphold these people in your thoughts and your prayers, send positive energy. And, encourage somebody today. Spread some hope, spread some positivity. You are a light in the darkness, and just be someone who leads with compassion and empathy. Thanks, Chris, for taking some time to discuss these controversial topics with me today, brother. As always, guys, like and subscribe on YouTube. Share the podcast with somebody else and get empowered today to build a beautiful, enduring legacy. Until next time, we'll see you guys. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please be sure you subscribe on YouTube or the podcast on anchor.fm and follow me on social media at Metalpreneur. If you're ready to talk about building your own bank, use the QR code or go to rebrand.ly/buildabank. Be sure and join us for the next broadcast, as together we learn to live and operate just like the banks do.